Hello, everyone. Welcome back to another episode of The Greatest Record Ever Made. I'm Carl Caffarelli, the co-host of This Is Rock and Roll Radio with Dan and Carl, heard every Sunday night from 9 to midnight here in Syracuse at WSPJ-LP Syracuse, 103.3 and 93.7 FM, and on the web at sparksyracuse.org. I'm also a writer, and I'm working on my first book, The Greatest Record Ever Made, Volume 1, dedicated to the notion that an infinite number of individual great songs can each be the greatest record ever made as long as they take turns. And they've got to take turns. That's what records do. The subject at hand today is a song called Promised Land, which is a relatively lesser-known track by the great Mr. Chuck Berry. Now, I was born in 1960, so I'm a little too young to have experienced Chuck Berry firsthand. His heyday was in the 50s, though he never really went away. But my introduction to Chuck Berry's music was vicarious through the Beatles. The Beatles were big Chuck Berry fans. I've often said that if the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame had to honor only three performers, and three performers only, the three performers would have to be the Beatles, Elvis Presley, and Chuck Berry. And if it's just two, Elvis Presley and Chuck Berry, because the Beatles don't happen without Elvis Presley and Chuck Berry building the fortress first. As a kid, we had an album called Beatles 65. It's an American compilation album. It is rightly reviled throughout the rest of the world, but it is beloved by me. This is how we Americans heard the Beatles. So we have a great fondness for these hatchet jobs, if you will. And Beatles 65 included a song called Rock and Roll Music, which was written and originally recorded by Chuck Berry. Although it's certainly possible, maybe even likely, that I heard Chuck Berry's own music sometime as a kid in the 60s, my first conscious exposure to Chuck Berry himself was when one of the local AM radio top 40 stations in Syracuse, either WNDR or WOLF, the two stations that I bounced back and forth between, started playing Johnny B. Goode in regular rotation as part of its top 40 playlist. Later on, a friend of mine who worked in radio would tell me that was what was called an image song, where a station would pluck out a classic, if you will, and put it in amongst its usual fare to be something that a listener would hear and recognize, oh, cool, and be gravitated toward, and then they'd be able to sell them beer or whatever. But to me, I did not know that Johnny B. Goode was an old song. To me, it was just a great new song. Any song you ain't heard is a new song. It doesn't matter when it's from, it's new to you. That's how you get new favorites, and that's how you get to the greatest record ever made. My first Chuck Berry record was a greatest hits set that I bought in the early 80s when I was living in Brockport, having graduated from Brockport college there. And I bought a used copy of Chuck Berry's Greatest Hits at Main Street Records in Brockport. My specific impetus for getting it was because I was just suddenly madly in love with the song Sweet Little 16. I just could not get enough of it. I needed to own the vinyl. I went on to own a couple of Chuck Berry albums, had a couple of twofers that were double album reissues of two Chuck Berry albums in one gatefold package. Most of those, actually all of those, are gone. I didn't really keep a lot of my vinyl. Dirty little secret, I'm not really a vinyl collector. I don't listen to vinyl all that much. Please don't hate me. Please don't hate me. I'm good. I'm on your side. But I started listening more to the CDs. I do have one Chuck Berry album I got just because I wanted to have a Chuck Berry album in my LP archives. This album, however, let's open it up because it's got a picture of Chuck Berry in it. Mr. Chuck Berry does not have Promised Land. Chuck Berry's Promised Land is on this two CD set that is my go-to Chuck Berry document. For some reason, I gravitated to the song Promised Land. It's an unusual choice for one to name as a favorite Chuck Berry song, and probably even more unusual to name as the greatest record ever made. But there's something about the song that I find irresistible. I really cannot get enough of the song. Well, characteristic of the greatest record ever made, I want to hear it over and over again. Dana, my co-host, says I want to hear it a little bit too often, I think, but it's a great song, and great songs should be played over and over again. It's stated lyrical expression of freedom, of the poor boy leaving his town in Norfolk, Virginia, California on his mind, resonates because that's the American story. It's the story that fuels my all-time favorite novel, The Grapes of Wrath by John Steinbeck, with Tom Joad and his family leaving Oklahoma during the Dust Bowl rather, to seek a new life in California. Similar to something that members of my own family, my mother's family, in that same post-Depression time frame, left Southwest Missouri to seek a better life in California. Seeking a better life is the American dream. That's the promised land. That is what we yearn for. That is much of what our ideals as a nation are built on. I'm not going to get too much into politics, but I'm going to get a little bit into politics because I'm sitting here today nervously awaiting the results of the U.S. 2020 presidential election. I don't think we're getting to the promised land. I don't think we're going to see the promised land in my lifetime, and that's a shame. After the 2016 election, shortly after that, I wrote this, which isn't really specifically related to Chuck Berry's Promised Land, but I made a connection in my mind. Got to keep walking. I thought we'd arrived, or at least come close. The road seemed more welcoming, more secure, a more encouraging path than it had been for, God, forever. There was discontent on both sides of the road, but there was progress, forward movement, hope. It wasn't the promised land, not yet. But we were heading toward it, slowly but surely. I could see its glow, feel its warmth, almost smell the sweetness of its soft, inviting air. But suddenly the road seemed more perilous once more, the route more like a maze. The destination that I swear we had almost reached is somehow farther away, so far away that I don't know how we'll ever get there again. Got to keep walking. Got to keep hoping. Got to keep walking. Sometimes hope is all we have. Hope is expressed in our music, in our art, in the things we love to do, in the affection we have for family and friends, in the promise of what may lay ahead. Sometimes the promised land is out of reach. But like the poor boy from Norfolk, Virginia, we still keep trying for that jet to the promised land. Thank you for joining me. Below, you'll see options to support and tip. I will include a link to the chapter from my book on Promised Land by Chuck Berry. And I hope that you and yours stay safe and sound. Next week, we'll be back to talk about Dusty Springfield, and I Only Want to Be With You, the greatest record ever made. Thanks for joining me.